Back on old trains like old love affairs, stirring mixed memories, telling scraps of powerful stories, churning up the past.
From crocodiles to coffee beans, poet and novelist Lisa Santobin de Terran journeys across South America.
I feel like an early explorer now, setting off on an adventure into the unknown.
Great railway journeys, from Santos to Santa Cruz. Thursday at 9:30 on BBC2.
Back home here on BBC1 now, Patrick Moore focuses on the sky at night.
Good evening. Well, the great news is that the Hubble Space Telescope repair mission has been a complete success. Let me show you what's happened. Here's a picture of the spiral galaxy, Messier 100, taken by Hubble before the repair. And here is the new picture, and what a difference. And we now know that the telescope is going to be every bit as good as was planned, and that is really tremendous. Do you know where to find Quetzalcoatl, Huang Chi, Erxpedem, and Juvenile Ganubi? Well, I can tell you. You'll find them in the sky. And some of the sky names really are rather bizarre. Now, I thought it might be fun to say something about them. So let's begin with the moon. The naked eye shows you dark patches on the moon. They were once thought to be seas, and they were named accordingly. The Sea of Tranquility, Ocean of Storms, and so on, even though they're not seas and never were. But there are also craters. In 1651, the Italian astronomer Riccioli drew a map of the moon and adopted a system of naming craters after famous people, generally astronomers. For example, that large, flat-floored crater down to the lower right was named Ptolemaeus after the last great astronomer of Greek times. And that was a good system, and this worked very well, and we still use it, though of course it has been extended since to accommodate later astronomers. With the planets, we come to mythology. Now, Mars was the god of war, and therefore Mars, the red planet, was named accordingly. And there is a Viking picture of Mars. But from Earth, we can see bright and dark areas on it, and those were named originally in the 1860s. And a map of Mars was drawn by the English astronomer Richard Proctor, and there is Proctor's map. And he followed Riccioli's principle and named the features upon Mars after famous people. For example, that triangular area on the left-hand map, near the middle of the picture, was named the Kaiser Sea, after a German astronomer who thought them to be a sea. And above that we have Lockyer Land, after a famous British astronomer. Now, that wasn't very well received. In 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli in Italy made observations of Mars. I may say he drew maps including the famous Martian canals, and there's a Schiaparelli map, and those canals, I'm afraid, don't exist at all. They were tricks of the eye. But Schiaparelli also altered all the names and went back to mythology and geography. For example, in his map, out goes the Kaiser Sea, in comes the Syrtis Major, which is the Libyan Gulf. Out goes Lockyer Land, in comes Hellas, the original name for Greece. And we still use those names, though in some cases they've had to be modified. For example, Schiaparelli saw a bright speck that he called Nix Olympica, the Olympic snow. And I've seen it with my own telescope. He didn't know what it was. We now know, thanks to the space probes, it is a huge volcano, 15 miles high. Look at that, with a 40-mile crater on the top. And we now call that Olympus Mons, or Mount Olympus. So we have mythology there, and the two tiny satellites of Mars, discovered in 1877, have been named Phobos and Deimos after the mythological attendants of the war god. Next, what about Mercury, the innermost planet? Very quick-moving, and therefore named in honor of the messenger of the gods. By no means easy to study, it's only about 3,000 miles across, and always stays close to the sun in the sky. Incidentally, for the first part of this month, you can see it very low down in the southwest after sunset. The best pre-space age map was drawn by the Greek astronomer Eugenios Antoniadi, who used a very powerful telescope at the Observatory of Meudon, the 33-inch. And he produced a map of Mercury in the 1930s, and he gave the dark features that he saw names, such as Solitude of Hermes Trismegistus, the wilderness of Hermes, the thrice greatest. But through no fault of his own, his map was not accurate, and his names are not being retained. Our only real information comes from one probe, Mariner 10, which made 3 active passes of Mercury in the 1970s, and sent back pictures showing craters, mountains, and other features looking rather like those of the moon. Now, naming is the responsibility of the controlling body of world astronomy, the International Astronomical Union, and they've rather followed Riccioli and given the crater names after personalities. But there are one or two exceptions. There, on the left-hand side, you will see part of a huge ringed basin, and that's called the Caloris basin, or the heat basin, because when Mercury is closer to the sun is almost overhead from that basin, and the temperature rockets to over 700 degrees Fahrenheit, so the Caloris basin is the good name for it. With the moon, Mars and Mercury, you can see features. With Venus, of course, you can't. Now, with the naked eye, Venus is lovely. Name it after the goddess of beauty. But we can't see through the dense atmosphere, and even space probe pictures can't do that. There's one of them. All we're seeing is the top part of a layer of cloud. But thanks to radar, we can now penetrate the cloud, and this has been done by various probes, including Magellan, and that's what Venus might look like if we could see through the atmosphere. And we now know there are high mountains there are craters, and there are valleys, and they all have to be named. And to be entirely politically correct, the IAU has laid down that all names on Venus must be female. Some are familiar. There, for example, is Cleopatra. But what about those 3 I mentioned earlier? Quetzalcoatl, Huangqi, and Erxleben. But if you want to know, they are respectively an Aztec fertility goddess, a Chinese poetess, and a German scholar. I thought you'd like to know. And just imagine what happens if we ever terraform Venus and go there. And we're driving along and come to a road junction. Do you go to Altamira Road on one way or Huangqi motorway on the other? I don't know. There is, incidentally, one masculine name on Venus. This is Dula Mons in the range of mountain known as the Maxwell Mountains. And they are named after the Scottish mathematician James Clerk Maxwell. And that was done before the IAU edict was passed. And so Maxwell is the only man anywhere on Venus. What about the giant planet? Jupiter, the king of the gods, the main planet is named in his honor, which is quite right. The satellites, the 4 main ones, are also given mythological names. Here's a mosaic of Jupiter and the 4 main satellites from Voyager pictures, and those satellites are Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto, all of which are mythological. For example, Ganymede was the cupbearer of the gods. But features on these satellites have now been seen by the Voyagers, and they've been named by the International Astronomical Union. For example, consider Callisto, the outer satellite, with an icy, cratered surface. The names there come from Norse mythology. There's one huge ringed basin, there it is, and that's named Valhalla, which I think is rather a good name for it. Beyond Jupiter, the outermost planet known in ancient times, named after Saturn, who was Jupiter's father and also the god of time. Again, there are satellites. Again, the names there have been given according to mythological characters. Here, for example, is Dione, who was Saturn's wife, and also his sister. I'm afraid the morals of the old Olympians don't really stand up for examination. Now, what about the planets discovered in telescopic times? In 1781, William Herschel discovered a new world, and it's now known as Uranus, after Saturn's father and the first ruler of Olympus. Herschel himself wanted to call it the Georgian star, after King George III, but that wasn't at all popular, and finally Uranus was adopted. The outermost giant planet was then discovered and was named Neptune after the sea god, and that, I think, again, was a good mythological name. But what about the satellites of these outer planets? Uranus has a whole family. John Herschel, William Herschel's son, suggested naming the first 4 not after mythological characters, but after characters in Shakespeare's plays and Pope's poem, The Rape of the Lock. And they were named Ariel, Umbriel, Titania, and Oberon. And when another satellite was found, in 1948 by Kuiper, that was also given a Shakespearean name, Miranda. So there we have a departure from the norm, which I think is a great pity. But when we come to the satellites of Neptune, we are back to mythology. And the main satellite of Neptune is named Triton after a minor sea god. And there's that lovely Voyager 2 picture of Triton with a pink snowcap with the active geysers. There is one more planet, if we can call it a planet, discovered in 1930 by my old friend Clyde Tombaugh. And a name had to be found for it. One name suggested was Minerva, but that was proposed by an American astronomer, TJJC, who was very unpopular with his colleagues. So his name was not accepted, and instead it was named Pluto, after the god of the underworld. And that, I think, is quite a suitable name, because Pluto is far out in the solar system, and Pluto's kingdom must have been a gloomy place. Then, in 1977, a satellite was discovered, and that was called Charon, after the gloomy ferryman who used to take departed souls across the river Styx into Pluto's kingdom. And there's a Hubble picture of Pluto and Charon seen separately. So much then for planets. What about asteroids? Now, they mainly lie in the region between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. The first was discovered in 1801 by Piazzi at Palermo. Now, asteroids can be named by their discoverers, and Piazzi suggested the name Ceres after the patron goddess of Sicily. And there's a picture of Ceres on the end of the arrow. That was very good. Later asteroids were also given mythological names. But very soon, the supply began to run out, and by now, thousands of asteroids are known, and some of the names are rather interesting. For example, asteroid 2309 is named Mr. Spock, after a ginger cat, which was itself named after Mr. Spock of Star Trek fame. And I can't resist showing you a picture of asteroid 2602, discovered by Dr. Boyle at the Lowell Observatory. There it is on the end of the arrow, and there it is 2 days later when it was shifted. And he really kindly named it after me, so asteroid 2602 is now officially known as Moore, and as Clyde Tombaugh said about his asteroid, at least I now have a piece of real estate that no one can touch. Comets are usually named after their discoverers. For example, the bright comet of 1970, Bennett's comet, discovered by Jack Bennett from South Africa. But sometimes after the mathematicians who first computed their orbits. Here's a picture of the Statue of Merit Tussauds of Edmund Halley, who should really be Hawley, the second astronomer royal. He observed a bright comet in 1682 and realized that it came back regularly every 76 years, so he predicted a return for 1758, and it duly turned up, and quite rightly, it's now known as Halley's Comet, and of course it last came back in 1986, and it'll be back once more in the year 2061. And another comet named after a mathematician is Encke's Comet. There it is, that fuzz over to the right-hand side of the picture. And that comes back every 3 and a third years, and the man who realized they did precisely that was the director of the Berlin Observatory, Johann Encke, and it's named after him. It has a very small orbit, doesn't go as far as Jupiter, and we can actually now follow it for the entire time, so we can always see Encke's Comet with powerful telescopes. Now, when we come to the stars, we are back to mythology. But do bear in mind that what we call a constellation has no real significance, but the stars in any particular constellation are at very different distances from us. Some may be in the background, so to speak, and they are not genuinely associated with each other. So, for example, had we followed the Chinese or the Egyptian patterns, our star maps would look quite different, even though the stars would be the same. We follow the Greek patterns. For example, there is Orion, the hunter, that lovely constellation which dominates the evening sky all the way through the winter and into early spring. Has 2 brilliant stars, and you can't mistake the pattern. That's named after the great mythological hunter who boasted